Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to just give it a second and make sure that we've got everybody in that's going to join us here, and we'll get started in just a moment. Actually, as we're getting started, I'd love for anybody that's on right now that has heard my podcast, the Destination Marketing Podcast, just put in the chat whether you've heard it or not. That'll help me understand how familiar you guys are with me. Jen's on both sides. She's a guest. Dakota, awesome. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and dive into my presentation here. Oh, Rebecca Peters, regular listener. Rebecca, glad you're here. See if there's anybody else before we jump in here. Great. I'd also love if anybody wants to put who you are and where you're from in the chat. That'll help me also know who's on. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Share my screen here, and I hope you'll all be patient with me today. I'm a big BYU basketball fan, and last night I took my daughter to the BYU versus Gonzaga game, and Gonzaga is number 7 in the country, and BYU's not very good. Uh, at the game last night, I was yelling and screaming, and BYU played really, really well, and they were up by a couple of points going in with a minute left in the game, and lost a heartbreaker. And so lots of screaming, and then ending in disappointment. So my voice is a little bit more scratchy and deep this morning because of all my screaming last night. But I am excited to be here and present at DestiCon, and I really appreciate the opportunity. This event's going to be a fun event as it continues to mature over the years, and I think Jen and her team have done an excellent job putting it together. So, again, really grateful to be here. I'm going to talk about a concept that I'm extremely passionate about, something that it's funny because, and I'll walk you through a little bit of my journey today, but my view has expanded on this so much. The way I kind of this, and by the way, I there's a couple things that I'll just give you. I guess why should you care what I have to say? I think the first one is I've written a book called Touch Points that if anybody wants a free copy, you can actually just send me an email at adam@relicagency.com and let me know in the subject line that you'd like a copy of my book, and I'll go ahead and send it out to you. Um, but Okay. Sorry, I got a message there that derailed me a little bit, but I wanted to let you know that for the Destination Marketing Podcast and the journey that led to it, I started this podcast back in 2019, and it was really in an effort to to get people to or to give a place for people to see that we knew what we were talking about as an advertising agency. I own an advertising agency called Relic, and we really want could see that we knew destination marketing, and that's how it started. And then it's amazing over the years how it's evolved. And there's only about 10,000 or so destination marketers in the industry, and we've gotten now at this point in the next week or so, I think we're going to hit 80,000 downloads on my podcast. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is I bring on amazing guests onto my show, people from all over the industry, and Jen was my most recent episode here. And uh, these people really share unique and interesting things that they're doing in the industry. And it's really insightful and helpful for people that are trying to navigate the different challenges that come along with destination marketing. Um, in addition, um, sorry, Dakota sent me a message here. Oh, looks like the Jennifer has also listened to the show. In addition to having these guests on, one thing that's really important to me is to have a takeaway in each episode, something very tactical that you can implement. So when we cover a topic, one of the questions I'm asking is how can people actually use this in their destination? I think people have found a lot of value in that. But as I've been doing this show, my understanding of podcasting and owned media as a whole has really evolved and expanded. And it started to expand when I had destinations start asking me, "Hey, can you help us start a podcast?" And originally, it was like, "No, we're an ad agency. We don't really help people start podcasts. That's just something we do for ourselves." And then as the request continued to come in, we finally said, "You know what? Let's give this a try." And we created this turnkey process for destinations to be able to create podcasts without heavy lifting. And as we got into that, our view continued to expand on the value of this. We created a podcast network called the Destination Marketing Network, or excuse me, Destination Marketing Podcast Network. And here you can actually see a variety of shows that we manage in the Destination Marketing Podcast Network, and a couple of them that are even outside the network that are totally owned by the destination. So we do it on both sides, but we've been able to really pioneer this idea of podcasts for tourism destinations. And I'm going to tell you today why it works. And so we're going to zoom out a little bit and talk about owned media. And then we're going to zoom back in and talk about why a podcast is an important thing for each destination out there to have. Um, and to zoom out a little bit, I think it's important that we talk about the three different types of media that are out there. And many of you are going to be familiar with this. The first is earned media, and I actually think, excuse me, this is where the screaming from last night is coming in. But this is where I think tourism destinations are doing a really good job. Tourism destinations understand the value of public relations, and the way I would describe earned media as a whole is getting other people to tell your story without paying them to do so, right? So you've got earned media through public relations, where you're getting news outlets or travel writers, or maybe you're bringing in a fam tour with travel writers, and you basically demonstrate your story well enough to where they want to go tell it for you. You can also get social posts by others and influencers, not through a paid partnership. If it's a paid partnership, I would associate that a little bit more with owned media. And then any other way that you're getting other people to tell your story to their audiences, I would consider all of that to be earned media. And again, I think destinations do an incredible job with this for the most part. I think there's many PR agencies that are doing a great job, many internal PR teams that are doing a great job. And I really I see a lot of success stories in earned media in the industry. Paid media. This is another place where I think the industry is doing a lot of work. There's a lot of advertising agencies and internal teams that are doing a great job with paid media. This includes both digital and traditional media. I think the one thing that's important to note here, excuse me, is that with paid media, someone else has, and I think earned media is very similar, but the application is different. Someone else has done the work to build an audience with whatever platform they're using, and you are now renting access to these audiences, right? And so if you think about Facebook over time, Facebook spent years and years building its audience. I mean, if any social network. They took forever to want to monetize that audience. The whole point was building and building the audience. And then, of course, once they monetized, they were able to really turn on the jets with their revenue and grow. And the same goes for these other platforms: Instagram, Google, Twitter, and even outdoor, which is billboards and signage, TV, radio. All of them have built these large audiences, and we are renting access to them. I think and by the way, I own an advertising agency. I'm very passionate about earned and paid media. Um, and so I'm not saying that these shouldn't be done. I actually think that a good marketer should be managing all three of these major types of media to do a good job. But I see the industry doing a good job with both earned and paid media. The place that I think is kind of a blind spot in the industry is now I would consider owned media any platform that you have the ability to control the messaging entirely to your audience, right? Now, there is an argument, and I've heard this argument in several places. There's an argument that there's an additional type of media called shared media. And that's where a lot of people want to lump in the social media channels. And so, for example, if you're posting on your Instagram page, some people would call that shared media because Instagram still owns the audience. Um, However, you own the distribution of the message within it, but they could take that away at any time. And that's why a lot of people say, well, that's an additional category. It's shared media. For the sake of simplicity, I'm including it here in owned media because you do still control the message. Um, so email marketing automation is definitely a vehicle for owned media, and a place where you control the message. Podcast is another one. Website content is an owned media channel, and a lot of people, there's a mistake that I see in the industry that a lot of people will spend the money to build their website, and then it sits for 5 or 6 years until they decide that they need a redesign. I think that a website should be much more of a living, breathing, evolving thing that you continue to manage as an owned media channel. So you have to look at it a little bit differently. And then we talked about social media channels, there's text messaging lists, and anywhere else where you're actually controlling the message and the distribution of the message. I've got several examples of the reason for building an audience, but one of the examples that I'm going to share is I listen to a podcast that may come as a surprise that I listen to a podcast, but I listen to a podcast called the All In Podcast, and it's several. I don't know if they're multimillionaires or billionaires or whatever, but they're incredibly successful in business, and they speak weekly on current events. And if they were running a business, how would they react to current events? It's a really fascinating listen for me, and has helped me kind of think differently about some of the challenges that I've dealt with in business. But one of the things that they talked about was that in 2022, for the first few quarters, Salesforce is a really good, and Salesforce is a tech company in the tech industry that is a pretty good bellwether for what's happening in the industry. So what they do is they're a platform that kind of helps you collect all the data from the different marketing channels that you're using, and then it's a CRM that helps you communicate with your potential customers and it ultimately leverage them through to a sale. Some of you may even use Salesforce for meetings and conventions. But anyway, Salesforce's cost to acquire a customer through the media channels that they were using went up in fourth quarter by 70%. And so if you think about that, if all of their advertising activities had been off of specific numbers, it costs this much to get a lead, this many leads to get a customer, and we know exactly what it costs us to get a new customer. Think about how all of a sudden in fourth quarter, if that goes up by 70%, all their numbers are out of whack. And the reason that they're a little bit beholden to that change is because most of their activities were through paid media on social platforms where the expense of advertising was going up. And so because of that, because they hadn't built their own audience, they didn't have a lot of control over what was going to happen to their expenses. And so for those of you that are spending money on media, one of the thought processes here, and I'm actually going to quote Stuart Butler from Myrtle Beach. He says every destination should be taking a portion of their budget and putting that budget into owned media so that they're starting to build their own audience and that they're not going to be eternally beholden to uh, these paid platforms where the costs are inevitably going to go up because these companies need to make more money. So, owned media is a really interesting concept. I actually have a couple of benefits here, and I want to make sure that I mention these. I talked about owning your audience versus renting your audience. The challenge is you have to be prepared that it's the long game, right? Like you're not going to have an audience that equals the value of Facebook's audience, and you may never have an audience that's as large as Facebook's audience. But it's going to take a long time to build that, right? And you've got to be prepared for that. And when a lot of our stakeholders, especially the kind of mindset of And by the way, I'm not criticizing them because they need heads in beds. They need to get immediate results from the advertising that you're doing. But the problem is if you're only focused on those immediate returns consistently, you might be missing the forest for the trees, and you're going to end up not building that audience, and then you're forever beholden to those media channels. So you do have to understand that it is the long game, but there is a lot of value in building that audience over time. You also have complete control of the narrative. One of the dangers of letting other people tell your story is it doesn't get told in your brand tone. It also, if there's a negative thing that happens, and a lot of you have experienced this, if something bad happens in your destination and it's covered by the media decides how you come out in most cases in that story. And in fact, when I was doing my CDME training at Destinations International, we reviewed several case studies. They had to do some serious crisis management because of some negative destinations that had to do some serious crisis management because of negative stories that were run in the press. So controlling the narrative on your owned media channels is a really high value part of focusing on owned media. The value of audiences is increasing. We talked a little bit about that. I'll just add the fact that when you think about, I'll give you one example. I gave this on my show, but I'll do it again. There are several organizations that have built massive audiences that have now started creating commoditized products, and they're distributing it to their platform because of the loyalty of their audience. So, for example, there's a podcast network out there that had an advertiser. It was a razor company, and this razor company got frustrated with some of the comments that happened by a host on, and they pulled their entire advertising spend. Network, instead of going and trying to replace the advertiser, they created their own razor company, and it was a subscription model. And in the first 3 weeks, they sold 26,000 subscriptions to their razor product because of the loyalty of their audience, and were generating so much more revenue than they were actually receiving from the advertiser. The value of owning an audience is going up because there's a shift happening where people are buying more from people than they are from brands. And a prediction that some people have made is that the value of owning your audience is that these legacy brands that only focus on paid media could eventually start dying because of the loyalty that's happening with all these different people that have built audiences. Another great example is Mr. Beast. How many of you follow Mr. Beast, but definitely he's got one of the larger audiences out there, and he launched a company called Mr. Beast Burger. He's selling burgers, and he had over 100,000 people show up to the launch of his first burger joint in LA, and that's the power of having a loyal audience. Um, you also have the ability to build a multi-touch engagement ecosystem for your audience. Essentially, what that means is if you do it right and you have, like, for example, let's say you started a podcast and you're building an audience, you can actually create multiple touch points. There I am quoting the title of my book, but you can create multiple touch points where people can interact with your brand, and you can leverage them from an audience to become an actual visitor. And we'll talk about that revised marketing funnel in a moment. And then, of course, you can future proof against unexpected changes to these other platforms that you're renting access to. And I think that's one of the real values, building an owned audience. And that's the reason that I am so passionate about owned media is I want to help destinations hedge against a changing ecosystem that, for example, those of you that have been primarily using SEO, every time the algorithm changes on Google, we're panicking, right? And so how do we future proof from that? Well, we'd have to build our own audience. So let's talk about the marketing funnel. Many of you are familiar with the marketing funnel. When you're using paid media, it's awareness. First, people have to know who you are, right? Then they consider you between other destinations. And then, of course, eventually they'll purchase. Now, some people modify this where they'll add advocacy as another category in the funnel at the very bottom. Some will add retention. And yes, all of that's true. But we're looking at it just in the 3 steps of awareness, consideration, and purchase. The owned media marketing funnel is a little bit different. And this is what I've found over time in helping destinations build podcasts, and now expanding with a full owned media strategy. And that's the when you're building content that's meant to build an audience, this is not just sales content. This is not just an ad that says come visit. You're building entertainment that grabs the audience's attention. So you're not getting what I would call buying attention. You're getting entertainment attention. And that happens in the awareness phase if you're using the owned media funnel. The second step is that in that is engagement. So if you're building content that's interesting and valuable enough to where people want to continue to follow, maybe they're going to press the follow button on the podcast platform that they listen to, or maybe they're going to subscribe to your email list. They're engaging in some way, and that's how you know that first you've generated enough valuable, not enough, but you've generated valuable content that has action from that audience. The next step in that is what we call active community. Now, it's funny. I mentioned to my friend Stuart Butler earlier. We are working with Myrtle Beach. We're their agency of record for all of their owned media channels that they're doing at Myrtle Beach, and building a pretty significant owned media strategy. And this active community, I originally called this permission, right? Where they actually give you their information and give you permission to continue to send them content on a consistent basis. A lot of these I wouldn't necessarily consider permission, and Stuart actually helped me develop this idea of active community, because it's one thing to get them to engage once, but the next step in that funnel is getting them to become an active part of your audience. I'll give you an example of what active community looks like. I had someone from Australia reach out to me from listening to my show earlier this week, and she asked a question about a very specific Instagram feature. And she asked me if I knew of any destinations that were using it really well. So instead of me just answering her question, because we do have clients that listen to that or that use that feature, instead I threw it out to my audience and I said, has anybody used this feature and had a lot of success that could help me answer this question for another listener? And my friend Jamie Hart from the Palm Beaches actually replied to that LinkedIn post. And she said, yeah, in our destination, we've been really successful with that feature. And here's somebody that can tell you more about it. And now I'm hoping to schedule a podcast episode with this person that she referred me to be able to go deeper on that specific tactic, and how the Palm Beaches has been successful with it. That's an active community. They're not just listening and then never interacting. They're asking questions, and then other people in the audience are answering. And that's in my mind, that's what I would mean by. Now, once you've generated an active community, that's when you're now focusing on inspiration to get them to come to the destination, to actually visit. And then, of course, you want them to purchase. And even one of the interesting things and differences between the owned media funnel and the paid media funnel is that in this purchase phase, some people may love your content and never actually book a trip. But then when somebody else is asking, hey, where should we go on a trip? We're considering multiple destinations. The person that maybe doesn't visit but is in the advocacy portion of that of the funnel might say, hey, have you considered Myrtle Beach? Myrtle Beach is amazing, and here's all the content I've consumed. And now all of a sudden they're becoming an advocate for you, even if they don't visit. And that only happens if you're building really amazing content. So we look at the funnel differently. It's not just place an ad, try to get their attention, and ask them to book. A much longer process or journey that you're walking the potential visitor through, and first getting them to engage with or to listen to your content or to consume your content, and move them through engagement, have them become part of an active community, inspire them to visit, and then lead eventually to a purchase. Um, and then, of course, I explained all of that, and I've got these slides that go a little bit deeper. So I think the first thing that I'll say in the awareness is it's so important that you're doing amazing storytelling, because if you look back at this funnel, this is a journey, right? And if you want people to go all the way through this journey, your content has to be good enough to get them to engage, to get them to be part of an engaged or an active community. And then the destination showcase is a secondary priority in this scenario. And what I mean by that is, and the term that I like to use is branded entertainment. If you are creating a podcast or using any of these other different owned media tactics, you need something that really captures people's interest first, and then of course they'll understand that the destination is the showcase. I think a great example of that is Myrtle Beach, and one of the podcasts that they're doing. It's called Myrtle Beach Karaoke, and what they're actually doing is they're highlighting all the different places where you can consume live music in Myrtle Beach. And so people are engaging with this kind of fun, interesting music content. And then, of course, yes, it is at Myrtle Beach, but we're leading with the entertainment first. And there's a lot to that show. There's another one where it's called On the Hook, where they're actually showing the seafood side of things, because Myrtle Beach is a great fishing destination, where they're showing how the fish is caught. They're showing what happens, and then where can you actually find that fish in the destination. Again, really interesting content that's not just saying, come to Myrtle Beach, come to Myrtle Beach, come to Myrtle Beach. Um, and so again, awareness, the most important part of awareness is making sure that you have really compelling content. Looks like Dave's got a comment here. um, Oh, Dave, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that feedback. The active community thing, I think it's really, really important to look at it differently than you would in just your paid marketing funnel. Let's talk about engagement. So the ways that you can get them to engage. I mentioned one that I did on my podcast called audience-driven storytelling, when you're actually asking the audience for topics and letting them play a part in the decision making of what topics you cover. You can create premium content that you can only access if you share your information. You can with the hosts or people that are featured in your owned media. You can do talent appearances. You can do merchandise, cross show promotion, which means if you have multiple shows like a YouTube series and a podcast and maybe a TV show, have that happen on multiple shows. So, for example, if I were running the marketing for the state of Montana, right? The state of Montana got an amazing windfall by having Yellowstone, this Hollywood creation, filmed in their destination, but it wasn't necessarily the destination didn't drive that. But what I would do then is I would create this supporting content, that maybe it's a watch party podcast, where every time there's a new episode of Yellowstone, we're going to meet and we're going to talk about the episode. We're going to talk about the characters and do a little bit of a and then maybe see if we can get some of the actors to come appear on the show. And again, that's the idea of having like some cross show promotion. So even though Montana didn't create Yellowstone, they should be leveraging that content. And the same thing, many of you have different pieces of entertainment that are being created in your destination, but you didn't create it. Capitalize on that. Start building content around it, even if it's not your specific content, and try to move them from the entertainment, or excuse me, the awareness part of the owned media funnel into your funnel by creating supporting content to that. Social media posts, video shorts, a blog, taking a show on the road and going to different places, creating Facebook and LinkedIn groups. A lot of people actually realized during the pandemic that if you hadn't created your Facebook or LinkedIn groups for your local stakeholders, you're really behind the eight ball in some of the community needed to do. And then, of course, retargeting and engagement for your audience. Active community. A way to create active community is first to collect email, maybe get listeners or audience members on your text list, create social groups, social follows. Direct mail is actually a great way to engage an active community or get people to become part of an active community. And then, of course, subscribing to your shows are all different ways to get them from engagement to active community. Um, Inspiration. This is where you want to create personalized content based on the permission data that you got. And I love email because of this. Because if one of your listeners to your podcast will give you their email address, you can actually, if you have a good CRM, you can track the activity that the content they're engaging with, either in email form or when they come to your website. And then you can start sending them personalized or content that feels personalized. And the example that I would say, if somebody clicks on an episode or an email that's featuring one of your episodes, they come to your website and they engage with hiking content, and then they get an email from you saying, "Here's the top 10 hikes in our destination." That's personalized content based on what you're getting from the permission data. Custom content for them, I would try to create whatever custom content you can based on their activities. And then the organization and distribution of existing content based on that permission data. So take all the content you've already created and start monitoring that permission data and sending. And if you have a good CRM, it'll do all of this. Send that content via email so that you can inspire an actual visit. And then purchase and advocacy. It's booking a trip and destination visit, or developing a lifelong supporter through advocacy. You could create a new funnel for that. And one of the questions we asked with Myrtle Beach is, how do we adequately measure that support, because it's difficult to measure advocacy. So something to think about is, like, how will we measure the advocacy portion of the funnel? Okay, so I want to move to podcasts now, because I think podcast is a really important component of owned media. Um, Many of you have probably heard me talk about this. 55% of Americans have listened to a podcast. Of that 55%, 37% of them listen once a month, and 24% of them listen weekly. And that's all Nielsen data. There's not many other media that can claim that type of market penetration. The difference is, because there's so many podcasts, it's very fragmented. And I think that's totally a fair argument. But the reality is, if you're creating valuable content that's tailored to a specific audience, listen, they are searching out topics on the podcast platforms, and they're looking for content to consume. A great example is my show. I did no promotion of my show early on, but I was smart to call it the Destination Marketing Podcast, because anybody that searches the term destination marketing in the podcast platforms, I'm going to pop up first, right? And so those keywords are being used kind of like a search engine. And so that if you create content for that specific audience, they will find you if you're using those keywords. 80% of listeners to podcasts listen to most or all of a single episode. That's because you're storytelling. Audio is a storytelling format. And so that's why people are so engaged. And it speaks to why podcasts are an important part of the landscape, because people want to consume the entire story. If they start a story, it's human nature to want to hear the end of it. That's why we don't like cliffhangers. um, why are podcasts so popular? So I've been talking about this for a long time, that the real difference between podcasts and really audio as a format versus all the other different types of content that we create. Think about how much you spent creating the content that's on your website now, whether that's a ton of time or money with an agency or however you got that content created. You spent all that time, and the reality is, when time is our most valuable asset now, I would argue very few visitors are consuming very much of that written content, and you can see that in your actual the time spent on site metric on your Google Analytics. You're probably averaging under 2 minutes per visit, and yet you've got hours and hours of content that can be consumed on your website. So this idea being passive consumption. I can listen to a podcast while I'm at the gym. I can listen to it while I'm folding laundry. I can listen to it while I'm in the shower. That is it's so much more freedom for the consumer to be able to consume it on their terms. Whereas all the other type of content you create, they have to consume it on your terms. And that's a big difference. So you actually are tailoring it to someone's priorities by creating content in audio format. Oh, Ryan Nelson. Okay, supporting my argument that the keywords are important. Ryan Nelson found my podcast through searching destination marketing on the podcast app. Guys, I hear that story all the time, and people are using. And this, I don't have this in the presentation. Google is a keyword that, or Google is a platform where people are using keywords to find search results. Aren't realizing is that these podcast platforms are being used as audio search engines. People want to learn, but they want to learn in a way they can consume it passively. So they're looking for podcasts and they're searching the keywords they want to learn about in these podcast platforms. And the podcast platforms are actually, in that sense, taking some search market share from Google. So again, if you're talking about things people want to learn about, they're going to find you because they're using it like a search engine. Um, I think we've also tackled this slide with passive versus active consumption. I believe you guys understand where I'm going with that. I think the thing I'll mention here is everybody is trying to do so much at once. They're multitasking. Again, that passive consumption concept is really important. We talked about buying, and I'm sorry about the gifts, guys. They're ridiculous, but I just can't stop using them. We want to get the right message to the right people at the right time to buy media, and we want to access audiences that might be difficult to reach, access to those audiences. And again, I just want to reiterate the importance of owned audiences. And this guy's just throwing his money down the drain. And we don't want to do that. So, again, I'm not criticizing paid media. It's just if you want to be a good marketer, you need to be leveraging all three types of media: paid, earned, and owned. My ad agency buys a lot of media for a lot of our clients, but we encourage everyone to be doing all three. Um, and I'm actually going to skip over some of this because I feel like I've already hit it pretty hard, because when you have an owned audience, you do have control, and you can reach audiences when and where you want. Um, again, I think I just want to touch on storytelling here. The other thing I'll talk about is stakeholder engagement. I haven't really touched on that yet. Do I have a slide on that? No. With stakeholder engagement, one of the things that some of our clients have found a lot of success with, reaching out to stakeholders that they may not have had a great relationship with before, or maybe they didn't have much of a relationship. And they reach out and say, "Hey, do you want to come tell your story on our destination podcast?" And to see the relationships that are being created or strengthened through this podcast format has been a really fun and kind of unforeseen part of what I thought would happen with podcasting. And the other thing that's happening is, with bringing these people on, so many stakeholders sometimes have the attitude of, "What have you done for me lately?" This is a very tangible piece of value that you can give a stakeholder to have them be featured on a podcast. And so that's been a really fun thing. We talked about storytelling and the value of it. Oh, there's my slide on stakeholders. We talked about the importance of stakeholders. You can also, by creating valuable content that your residents want to listen to. And in fact, I'll use another in Laredo, Texas. When we worked on their podcast, what they found is that the people that were consuming their content the most were actually locals. Locals want to know what's happening in the destination. And using a podcast to also engage locals, I think, is really helpful, in addition to just business stakeholders. So, what does Relic do? When we were trying to figure out this podcast product for tourism destinations, we realized that some of the biggest barriers were, bandwidth to do it is the one that I hear all the time. And then I don't know what equipment to do, so there's a knowledge barrier, right? And I don't know how to edit and all those kind of things. So we created kind of a streamlined process where our clients just have to really show up and record. So, we'll host, we'll produce and edit it, we'll create a content calendar, we handle all the distribution, getting it live and publishing on all the different platforms. We provide monthly analytics. There's marketing, supporting marketing to grow the audience if desired. And then we do a 50-50 rev share with our clients that are in the network. If they want to have advertising on the network, we'll do a 50-50 rev share. Our goal is to build the network large enough to where major advertisers want to come in and do a blanket buy across the network, and that'll subsidize the cost of this for all of the different destinations in the network. Some bonus benefits is, if you think about this audio format, these are keyword rich discussions for your destination that if you transcribe those, you can slice, dice, and repurpose those into, blog posts, social posts. And right now you're spending so much time and money developing this content that if you would start with a big rock piece of content like a podcast and then slice, dice, and repurpose, you can be way more efficient than you're being right now. Also, the transcriptions, if you upload the transcriptions of the podcast to your website, it'll really boost your SEO. It's evergreen content that you can use for additional audiences and content later. It really helps build the brand for the destination. I'm going to highlight a couple of the shows here. The Intercoastal podcast was the very first. This one's got a special place in my heart because when COVID hit, everybody else that we had lined up and ready to go kind of dropped off. And Rob Wells at the Intercoastal podcast, and that's Beaufort, South Carolina, said, "No, I'm going to move forward with this and give it a shot." And you can actually go back in my podcast to last year and hear how critical of a role the podcast plays in the marketing efforts for Beaufort, South Carolina. And it's really been a fun show for us to produce. This is another great one, Unexpected Adventures in North Alabama. They're our fastest growing show, and they have 16 counties or 16 destinations that they're representing. So it's a regional DMO. And so they have so much content that they're producing, and the audience is really kind of grasping onto that show. And our gone out and done some in-person recordings there, which has just kind of enhanced the quality to have everybody in the same room, and it's been a lot of fun. This is Stockton. So Stockton, California has been one of the fastest launches. They've gained their audience really quickly, and they really kind of helped us set the example of how a podcast launch should go in a destination. And of course, that's learning that we were able to take and implement. But that's another great show. And we've got so many more, but those are a few that I wanted to highlight. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'd love to open it up for Q&A here. If anybody wants to know about, whether it's owned media or podcasting or any other questions, I would be happy to chat. It looks like we have 18 minutes to do so. No questions. Jen, do you want to just help us get the conversation going here? I think everybody's just scared to ask the first question. How can I sign up? You know what? You're hired, Jen. Oh, Wes is on. Wes, I'm glad you're here. Man, good thing I didn't talk bad about Wes. Could you imagine?
Oh my gosh.
um, and I would never, Wes. But Jennifer, how do you sign up? I would say just right now, email me directly at adam@relicagency.com if you want to learn more. That's the easiest way. And yeah, we not everybody is a perfect fit, right? But we'll sit down and talk with everyone and walk you through owned media and podcasts and answer any questions you might have if it's more, specific.
Absolutely. I think everybody would benefit from a good conversation. We're super impressed with what you do, and we'll make sure in the chat to put Adam's link to his DMP podcast, and it's definitely a must listen.
Well, thank you, Jen. I really appreciate that. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, if any of you want to be a guest on my show and feel like you have a unique story to tell from your destination, I would love to have you as a guest. I'm working on my 2023 lineup right now, and I think it would be really nice to have some of you on. So if any of you want to join and talk about what you're doing in your destination, a tactical takeaway for someone else, I'd love to have you on. So use the same email for that as well.
Well, Adam, thank you so much. I've gotten texts since your session started going, I'm so inspired by Adam. So you've got some fans out there.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining today. I really appreciate it. This is something that rooftops as much as I can, because I think it's something we're a little bit behind on in the industry. I think we've ignored owned media for too long, and it's something that I'm really hoping to help change over the next year or two.
Agreed. And you guys make sure to join our next session with one of Adam's colleagues. Jerry Price is going to join us for tourism as a community shared value. It's going to be a great talk.
Can't wait to hear it. Well, thank